The flashlight burned bright as it sucked the phone's battery dry. All the power left was so precious, and if it went out then, so did Rebecca's chances. Twice more she threw herself. She gave it her right shoulder, and then her left. The door flinched each time, but it refused to yield. A sliver of light had managed to leak in from the side. Both of her shoulders protested against another blow, so she laid on her back, and with her feet she kicked and kicked. The battery fell to 2%. Her feet ached, especially her right ankle, as she felt her pain from earlier return in force. Pain didn't even slow her down. Regardless of how futile each kick seemed, she refused to stop. She was going to escape, or die trying. She had no idea how true that statement was. One moved in the corner of the light, squeezing its way through the newly formed crevasse between the door and the car. She didn't see it until it just about touched her leg. When she did, she instantly brought her knees to her chest. A thin mass, a fleshy tentacle, had entered the car. It squirmed around blindly on the seat. It pulled itself forward with what looked to be a fingernail. The battery slipped to 1%. A noise came behind her. Turning her head, she found that she was surrounded. Through the other door, more tentacles were starting to wedge their way through. The center of the seat offered little solace. As both sides grew closer, the glass behind her started to crackle, and even more protrusions pushed themselves through the cracks. They pushed their way through shards of glass, carrying each piece with them at the end of their arm. They were coming for her, but she was done hiding. If anything, their intrusion only encouraged her. Now it was her and her mother's survival on the line. With her booted heel, she squashed the singular tentacle that originally disturbed her space. It wiggled, pinned against the seat. She initially thought it was the blood that leaked from it, but it came slow and viscous. It stuck to her boot like syrup. With a disgusted shriek, she pushed the tentacle to the floor and out of her way. The door had been pulled open by those things to let the tentacle in, and she saw her chance. She offered up a final double-legged kick. The flashlight went out, and with a final yell, light flooded the car. She'd considered everything in the last several hours, every scenario that has danced through her mind like terrible daydreams. The memories of that man that had fed most of them. She thought about the crunching beneath his feet and those terrible screams. She wondered what she would find, but she was far more worried about what might find her. Rebecca wondered what the world would look like once she escaped, and to her disgust, nothing she imagined could compare to what she found. As soon as she'd kicked the door open and leapt from the car, she suddenly felt like she was standing on an alien world. There was a loud crunch when her boots hit the ground. It felt like she was standing on well-packed snow. Those things covered every square inch below her feet. In fact, they stretched on as far as she could see. All around, from horizon to horizon, the blobs dominated the landscape. It invoked thoughts of Mars in her head, as there was no green to be seen anywhere. The colour red stretched beyond her sight, seemingly into infinity. The land was rugged, and all the trees that she'd seen earlier along the sides of the fields were gone. The only major protrusions on the rugged landscape were where solidified shells around houses and cars still stood. They looked like they'd been scabbed over. Most had remained upright. They spotted the landscape in every direction. The old man's house still stood. The overhang of his porch sheltered his front door from the barrage. The now dried, hardened creatures seemed to form a cave around it. It was a relief to see that they hadn't reached everything. The silo had fallen. The pieces lay in a messy heap beside the house. The combined weight of the things must have been too much for it. Rebecca hoped that her house had held better. When she caught sight of the old man, she couldn't help herself. She shrieked. The old man was frozen, on one knee, halfway between her car and Miss Sanders' truck. He must have been going to check on him, the same as he had for her, when the things had got him. She saw it enter through his pants leg. A bundle of tendrils, very similar to the ones that invaded her car, must have snuck up his pants leg, down at his ankles where the skin was exposed. One had seemingly burrowed into his flesh. She followed the tendrils up like a snake. They coiled up his leg. They crawled along his body, and she thought she could see the tendrils branch apart under his clothes. They snaked around his body, but they all ended before they reached his neck. Blood soaked through the parts of his blue button-up shirt. The worst part was his head. It was forced back, held in place, and his mouth was agape. Sprouting from it, several dozen vein-like stems that ended in red plant-like petals rose towards the sky. Liquid circulated inside them, as if pumped in by the man's heart. The grotesque growths wouldn't have terrified her as much had it not been for the man's eyes. They were still open, and they were looking right at her. Then came a single laboured breath. He was still alive. She heaved, but her stomach offered nothing to expel. By the old man's feet, she saw a bulge in the ground, and another bundle of macabre flowers protruding from within. Rebecca knew they marked Mr. Sanders' grave, if she'd even call it that. Was he, too, still alive under there? Was that even possible? She prayed for mercy and Mr. Sanders' forgiveness. She knew she didn't deserve it. No, she couldn't have imagined this, not in her worst nightmares. Whatever those things were had grown into the man through him. She'd let another shriek loose, and then she saw his stomach twitch. The man grimaced as something moved inside him. Rebecca wasn't sure if there was a worse fate. The old man, his eyes wide with fear, gestured down. It took several motions of his eyes for her to even catch it, but once she noticed, she followed his gaze down. Rebecca hadn't noticed them before, but little fibrous structures stuck out of the blobs. Each one was several inches tall. They looked like red ferns. A similar one was wrapped around the old man's ankle. Looking at her own feet, she noticed that she'd stepped on one. The pressure from her boot had triggered one of the tentacles to slowly emerge from the blob below. It reached around blindly, unable to cling to the material of her boots. They weren't plants, they were snares. She nodded to the man and she thanked him. He didn't need to tell her for her to understand that it was imperative that she not let those extensions, those blood thorns, touch her skin. She didn't want to leave the old man. In fact, she offered to help, but he groaned in disapproval. Exerting himself, he managed to shoo her away with small motions of his hand. Through his stuffed throat, he tried to speak, but no words came out. Rebecca knew it was too late, so she went to his house, again forced to leave someone behind. A tear ran down the old man's cheek. It was like navigating a minefield, but Rebecca did it quickly and skillfully. The blood ferns were scarce enough, thankfully. If she stepped on one with her boots, it offered more than enough protection. The ground crunched like snow beneath her feet. When she stepped on something new, it caught her ear. The crunch she heard wasn't light, like snow, but heavy, like glass. Lifting her boot, she saw it embodied in the mass. Desensitization kept her moving, despite the appalling discovery beneath her foot. There was no mistaking it anymore. She knew she'd been right. She had stepped on a watch. Through the cavernous maw of the blobs, she made it onto the porch and she found the door unlocked. The house was abandoned as far as she could tell. She called several times to check, but no one responded. That made her incredibly thankful. She was still alone, sure, but she didn't want anyone in that house to see what had happened to the old man. There was a picture frame hung askew from the wall. In it, the old man stood with his family. He was about 5 years younger in it, and his wife and 3 grown sons smiled with him. The eldest son sat a toddler on his knee. He would probably be only about 8 now. She dreaded even to imagine. It was a stroke of luck that the keys were on the counter. An even bigger stroke of luck that the garage door had been left open. Inside sat a '98 Chevy with a battered red paint. Rebecca looked at the path before her. The truck would hopefully do. If those things couldn't stop her boots anymore, they sure as hell weren't going to stop a truck. They were dry, and that meant that they could be easily navigated. Hopefully. She hesitated getting inside the truck. She imagined, dreaded the idea that the rains would return. They would fall, and again she'd be trapped. This time she'd be without help, and without hope. With a single calming breath, she pulled the door open and took her seat. The engine purred, and it was the sweetest noise she'd ever heard. The terrain was bumpy at first, but she got used to it fast, and she set a course across the alien Earth. The road was lost beneath the surface of flesh, but Rebecca found her way. The houses, though covered, offered plenty in the way of navigation. They made the skeleton of her map. Memory filled the rest. Through the atrocious, unspeakable landscape she drove. Those plants had sprung up in unbelievable numbers. The rain must have infected anything that touched it. The larger the animal, the larger the plant. Passing a farm, she observed large bush-sized growths that sprouted from what used to be the cows. They were buried now, but she'd passed them that morning. She was glad that most of the plants were covered. She'd rather not know whose grave was whose. She did see some terrible scenes during her journey. Cars were scarce, but she didn't find a single survivor in any of them. She slowed to check, but every car had at least one open door. No one had been able to claim refuge inside. Instead, they found themselves trapped outside. The lucky ones, the ones who weren't buried, could only watch as Rebecca drove by. One had been glued to the side of his minivan. His arm reached out to Rebecca, but she couldn't take it. There was a couple, a man and woman, that broke Rebecca's heart. The woman had gotten infected at the knee when she'd fallen. Her husband's hand was frozen in place as it clenched the stems that emerged from her mouth. He tried to pull them loose, but those vines had used the contact to ensnare him as well. They ended him through the wrist. They stared at each other. Neither even looked to Rebecca as she drove by. They were trapped by their love. The twisted machinations of her predicament were granted some enlightenment when she saw the helicopter. It had been brought down into one of the fields, and around it stretched some surprisingly natural. It had etched out a crater around itself, a crater of dirt and fire. The fire caused by the collision had eaten away at the surrounding flesh. It had managed to etch out a radius about 3 times longer than the helicopter itself. Rebecca couldn't believe the sight. If dirt and fire would have ever caused her joy, it was good to see the things pushed back, to see them burnt, to see them beaten. That feeling died as she saw the cloud swirl above. An eye, like at the center of a hurricane, opened above. The winds picked up and threatened to pluck Rebecca's truck from the ground. Slamming on the brakes, she could only watch in awe what happened next. From within the eye, 3 large shapes descended, blacker than the night. Tentacles of enormous proportions dangled from the clouds. Surely they were thicker than skyscrapers and twice as tall. They hovered over the spot where the helicopter had crashed, examining it. Rebecca couldn't breathe as one retracted to the clouds, and its end split open into 5 pieces. 5 fingers. She could only watch as its, dare she say, hand disappeared behind the sky, and then reappeared grasping something massive. Pieces dropped from the hand, like sand from a fist, and splattered against the ground. The giant arm held its hand directly over the barren ground below, and then it started to release its hold. Like rain, pieces of flesh fell from the sky and lit the ground. They covered the helicopter, and they smothered the fire. Within moments, it had been like there had never been a disturbance at all. The thing above, pleased with his restoration, carried the remaining flesh in its grasp back into the clouds. The remaining 2 tentacles swung about the eye, surveying their monstrous masterpiece. One split his fingers apart, and it tenderly brushed against one of the plants. It was a gardener, tending to its garden. It was that sickening metaphor that brought Rebecca to the greatest revelation. The rain. All the people infected. They were all nothing more than the fertilizer. The creature above retracted into the heavens, and the eye closed. Rebecca no longer begged God for help. She cursed his name. The drive took almost half an hour. The town she'd called home her whole life was deserted and lifeless. Thankfully, there were very few stuck outside. She didn't even want to know how many of the obscured figures were friends, loved ones. She drove past. She figured and hoped that most had found refuge inside. Passing stores, she witnessed the truth. The doors were shut, but those things had spread inside anyways. People stood, trapped against the glass, like tortured mannequins. Random movements danced by some of the windows, but she didn't dare stop. Her home was so close. It was unrecognizable. Once beautiful, with 2 stories, yellow siding and a little stained glass rose in the front window. None of it could be seen beneath the disgusting layer of filth accumulated around it. The dead covered her house, and nothing was more sickening. That was what she thought, until she got out of the truck and reached the back of her house. Grief was not a strong enough word to describe how Rebecca felt. After all she'd seen, and after all she'd survived and fought for, it all led to this. There was only so much she could have done. The fates had been cruel that day. Her mother was on her knees, a full water pitcher in hand. Her old eyes found Rebecca. They were green, and still so bright. The vines hadn't taken hold completely, but Rebecca could see them moving. Only once, in that moment, was she ever thankful for her mother's condition. Rebecca was glad she probably couldn't comprehend what was happening to her. She didn't seem to be in any pain, and with the last energy of a beaten and broken woman, Rebecca fell into her mother's arms and hugged her. Her mother surprised her for one last time. "I love you," her mother said. It was all Rebecca needed. "I love you too," she replied. "You're right," her mother whispered into Rebecca's ear. "I don't think the plants even need this water." Rebecca managed a final laugh as the infection took hold.